Hi, and welcome to Rave Leader Chat, week number 13, focusing on Hebrews chapter 13. First, I just want to say a word of thanks. Thanks for running the race with perseverance. This is the second longest Rave study that we've done. Thank you. This is also one of the hardest books that we've had to look at, and as we said at the beginning, it is worth the effort in digging deep, and my prayer is that you all received a lot of that blessing as you dug deeper and as you encouraged your people to dig into some passages that some were very clear and great confirmation and encouragement, and some were a little bit challenging on the difficulties that the church then was facing that we face today, and unpacking some of the Old Testament imagery and a sacrificial system that we might more fully grasp the greatness and the betterness and the perfect sacrifice that is Jesus. So thanks again for leading your group. So we get to chapter 13, the last chapter, and this kind of long arc of encouragement and exhortation that has been true in the book of Hebrews now turns into what happens so often in New Testament books, kind of a little bit of a multi-directional encouragement and all sorts of quick applications and quick encouragements on what life should look like. So where other weeks there was like a long theme that kind of went through the entire chapter, this really is wrapping a lot of loose ends up and a lot of things that need to be applied. So chapter 13 begins with the call that we hear frequently throughout the Bible to practice Philadelphia, let brotherly love continue, be genuine. Really, it's a reminder that we are marked by Christ's love, and that one of the marks of the church is that we are to love one another. So let that brotherly, sisterly love, let the family of Christ be known for loving each other. And then what's great is this sort of unpacks that love is really applied through the next couple of verses. Verse 2, we were reminded that we are called to love strangers, show hospitality to strangers. And there's a reminder that it's at times you're entertaining angels unaware. Likely that is a reference back to Lot and Abraham back in the book of Genesis. But that we're called to love one another. We're made different by Christ's love for us, and we're called to be different in the way that we love. So we call verse 1 to love one another. Second, to love the stranger. Continue to show hospitality. Continue to be invitational and compassionate as we enter into the affliction of others. And then 3, remember those who are in prison. And the thought is that these are Christian brothers and sisters who are in prison for their faithfulness. And so we remember them as if we were them. And it's partly to identify that they could be us. And so we don't want to forget them. And then also those who are mistreated, since they are part of the body. And so questions 1 and 2 in the study guide are good on this first sort of 3 or 4 verses. Good discussion can be had there. And then we get to verses 4 and 5, and 4 and 5 kind of tie back into the illustration that's used at the beginning of the study guide, that what we're looking at is a communication between two parties where we don't necessarily know all the details. And so the reason behind verse 4 and 5 would be clear to the author, clear to the recipient, and not so clear to us. So you have this great encouragement about let marriage be held in honor by all, and let the marriage bed remain undefiled. It could be that one of the things that was going on in the first century is the Essenes, the folks who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were kind of disengaging from a lot of the worldly relationships, and there could have been an undercutting and an undermining in one branch of Judaism of marriage. We really don't know. We do know that this is a fantastic passage that affirms not only the covenant of marriage, but as it continues to go on, it speaks very clearly about a New Testament sexual ethic that we are to, anything outside of marriage is considered immorality, and anything once the marriage bond is made is adultery. And so it really kind of covers that pretty well. So often people are blinded to that kind of ethic in the New Testament, and it's very clearly stated here. And then so verse 6 sort of moves on to the promise that God will Well, actually, verse 5 then talks about the love of money. And so you've got this undercutting of marriage, and you have this now this undercutting of your contentment in Christ, and how the world continues to say, you need, you need, you need, you need. And so keep your life free from the love of money. Money cannot be your ultimate hope. And then be content with what you have. That contentment and gratitude is such a powerful antidote to the covetousness of life and the constant bombardment that we need more, that we're lacking. And then there ties into that reminder, I'll never leave you, forsake you, from Joshua chapter 1:5. And then that slides into the ability to live and have confidence to say, Psalm 118, verse 6, that the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Called to live a very different way of life. Verse 7 then is a call to remember, and remember your leaders. And what the leaders that are being spoken of here are the leaders of old, the leaders that first called them to faith and maybe first shaped this congregation that gathered together. And that really sort of makes sense, because now you're asked to remember those who spoke the word of God to you. It kind of ties into chapter 10, verse 32, that you were to recall your former days, the former days when you were living in faithfulness, the former days when you first came to faith, your former days when you had trusted leaders who led you. Remember them. And then there's that encouragement to consider the outcome of their life and imitate their faithfulness. You've seen the fullness of their life. You've seen the fruit that they left behind. You know the blessing that they've been to you. And so remember them and sort of give God thanks and praise to them. And then verse 8 is this fantastic verse. It's really the verse that sort of stands out in all of chapter 13. It's the verse that most people quote from chapter 13, is that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so what the context suggests is that the authors remind us of this great encouraging truth to live our lives on, because the people have forgotten how Jesus was faithful in the past, or maybe they're losing sight of that. And so that same faithfulness that those leaders of old proclaimed and declared to them, that first brought them to faith, that's the same faithfulness and the same presence of Jesus that exists today, and that's going to continue forever. And so it's a great reminder of the constancy of Christ's presence, whether we've experienced it the same way or not, that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And then that slides into this warning in verse 9. Since that's true, let's give you a warning. Don't be led away. Don't be led astray by diverse and strange teachings. And that could be that in the not too long after the church was started, it was, well, yeah, Jesus is good, but you also need to pick up some of the Judaic principles as well, or practices. And there's always been a temptation to say, well, Jesus is good for this subset of your life, this little area of your life, or maybe for this season of your life, but then something else is needed. And the author wants us to know that Christ is that one perfect sacrifice. Christ is the one who can clear our conscience, the only one. His grace is sufficient for this day and for all the days to come. He was faithful in the past. He's faithful in the present. He'll be faithful in the future. If you go back to that Joshua 1:5 passage, you can kind of hear that same thing. He was faithful to Joshua way back when, and he fulfilled that promise. And so we can count on his promises and be faithful in them today, because he's going to be faithful to the end, of that heavenly home that he's calling us to, that tent that was described in last week's chapter. So then there's this sort of segue into, I'll call it a transitional idea about this comparison of grace and food. And so there was maybe this idea that there were special foods to be eaten, or some of those old practices that wanted to be brought back. The author sort of pulls us back to Hebrews 9:9 and its comparison to 9:14. But it's grace that really strengthens and satisfies the heart. It's not foods. So we have not benefited from being devoted to those foods. And what's being reminded in verse 9:9 is that those other sacrifices, those Old Testament dietary laws, they cannot cleanse our conscience. They are partial, and they too are shadows and foretastes of what would come in the fullness of Christ. And so that kind of segues into this discussion of an altar, and the altar that we have in verse 10 is the cross, and therefore we have the right to eat. And the meal being described here is communion. And really, the ultimate purpose of all this discussion between 9 and into 13 is that Jesus' sacrifice took place in a certain way that was in some ways parallel to the Old Testament sacrifice. The sacrifice that's in mind here is the Day of Atonement purification sacrifice. And that part of that took place outside of the body, outside of the tent, what was understood as the holy place. And so what's really being said in verse 12 is that Jesus suffered outside of the gate, outside of the holy city of Jerusalem on Calvary. Jesus is sacrificed outside, and there's import to that he is purifying people by his blood. And so verse 13 is a call for us to remember there's not special places anymore. There's not a temple, a tabernacle, a tent that these things have to take place in. Because Christ purified outside the tent, we are reminded that his presence is everywhere. We're freed up from a specific space that these have to happen in because Christ dwells in us. Verse 14 then points us to that future hope that we've talked about. We're not looking for a lasting city here, that there is a city to come, a city that's been described multiple times throughout the latter half of this book, that Jesus is preparing for us in a perfect place for us. Last chapter, it was that new Jerusalem, that holy city, that new tent that we are called to. And then verse 15, 16, and 17 / 18 really are what do we do in response to that? What are the implications of all this being true? That Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and that he, once again, is that perfect sacrifice. What do we do first? Verse 15, we worship. We offer up our praise to him continually. Second, verse 16, we do not neglect to share with one another what we have, for such is pleasing to God. So we're called to worship, we're called to love through sharing, to sort of that picture in Acts chapter 2 that the church took care of one another's needs as they came up. They were generous and shared whatever they had for the good of the body. And then in verse 17, this always seems somewhat self-serving, obey your leaders. Well, that's now current leaders. That's their current ministers, if you will, at the time. And obey them. And it's a reminder that we're called to grow. And what I love about this passage is it reminds us of both aspects of that. The leaders are called to be faithful, and faithful to their job. What's their job? They are to watch over the souls of their flock. And they are supposed to give an account at the end. We hear sort of that echo of the book of Ezekiel where God says, hey, you need to go and tell these people the truth. And if you do that and they sin, that's on them. But if you don't do that, if you don't give them the truth, that's on you. So it's a reminder to leaders that their job is to keep watch over the flock and that they will be held accountable for how they watch over and how they love and instruct the people entrusted to them. But 18, let them do it with joy and not groaning, for that is of no advantage to us. So the first part of that is about the role of the leader, and the second part is the cooperative nature of the flock. And that if you don't participate in the sanctifying work of the Spirit, you don't participate in the leading and teaching of the under shepherd that God has placed over the flock, the person that it really punishes is you, because you don't grow. And so the threefold response to all that this is in 15 through 18 or 17 is that we are called to worship. We're called to love each other through active sharing and involvement in their lives, and we are called to grow. And that just really sort of reflects we're to connect in worship, we're to grow in small group discipleship, and we are to continue to go and serve and love actively through the sharing of our gifts, skills, and abilities. Verse 8, and that question 9 is good in the study guide to sort of wrestle through some of these and which ones we're strong with and which ones we're maybe more reticent to. Verse 18, a request for prayer. Pray for us that we would be acting honorable in all things. Again, it reminds us of the pastoral heart and the connection with this congregation. He can, even though the author has said there's some challenges about their faithfulness, he knows they're faithful enough to request prayer, and that their prayer would be righteous and effective, as is spoken in James. And I urge you, in order that I may be restored to you. He longs to come back and see this group and to be in right relationship with them. Verse 20 is this fantastic benediction. Now may the God of peace, it starts with this wonderful reminder of who Jesus is, the God who raised Jesus, the good shepherd by the blood of the eternal covenant. A reminder of a lot of these great themes, and a couple, that he didn't develop a whole lot with shepherd, but just a reminder of it. And then what's the purpose of that? Is that God might equip you with everything good that you would need to do his will. Because of who this God is, the benediction, the blessing is, may God equip you with everything you need to do his will perfectly. And as there's been this sort of, here's what it's supposed to look like, here's the warning, here's what it's supposed to look like, here's the warning, he entrusts the group back to God's hands and says, because he is so great, may he equip you with all strength to do everything and work through you, because that is pleasing in his sight, and all for Jesus' glory. 22 is a final appeal, and it's just an honest, so bear with this word of encouragement. The author knows that some of these words have been harder to hear, but that there's a great purpose for it. Quick update on Timothy in 23, and then lastly, the salutation. Greet all your leaders, and greet all the saints. Greetings to everybody. Then there's a quick, we offer greetings from the Italians. We don't know if those are Christians in Italy or people from Italy who are now Christians more locally. And then just that fantastic end, grace be to all of you. The last word is grace, and that's just a great bookend of this entire book. At the beginning, in former times and in former places, God spoke partially through the prophets, but now he has spoken through Jesus Christ. And the last word is grace. What has he spoken through Jesus Christ? He has spoken grace through the perfect sacrifice of his son. And so it's just a great way to end this letter. Thank you once again so much for your leadership, your care, and your loving the saints. May God continue to bless you as you serve in this way. Take care, and God bless.